Still talking about Martin Luther, and today what I want to do is finish up the whole series. And you know, when you do a series like this on Martin Luther, you have to painfully choose what you're going to leave in and what you don't have time to talk about in this short of a series. So I won't be talking about Luther's discovery of his famous tower experience. I won't be talking about his wonderful new definition of righteousness, at least not directly. I won't be talking about Luther's conception of faith or several other things that are fairly to very important in Luther's theology. But I do want to bring out some of what I think are the most essential points in Luther's mature doctrine of sin, doctrine of man, and doctrine of salvation, including his most important insight, I think, about justification. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Last week we saw that in the beginning, before about 1515 or 1516, Luther was, as he had been educated, a typical theologian of the Via Moderna, the modern way, that late medieval school of theology. But in Luther's lectures on Romans, which he gave in 1515 and 1516, Luther decisively broke away from that theology. And from that time forward, he basically had three convictions about theology of sin and grace. And we talked about those a little bit at the end of last week. First, Luther came to see that man's will is held captive by sin and incapable of doing good without grace. Free will, he said, without grace has absolutely no power to achieve righteousness. But of necessity, it is sin. Like Augustine before him, he thought that man's will was so damaged, so destroyed by the fall, that the only thing that he could do is sin. And therefore, the idea of the Via Moderna, that God does not deny His grace to the man who does his best, came to be seen by Luther as Pelagian. Because if the only thing in us is sin, and if in order to get God's grace we have to do what lies within us, apart from a special act of God's saving grace, then, well, if you do what lies within you, that becomes essentially a Pelagian idea. And thirdly, Luther came to see man as passive in salvation. So salvation, and particularly justification for Luther, comes to be seen not as something there where man's will cooperates with God's will, but as something where God alone takes the initiative and completes it from beginning to end. So, that was, in a nutshell, three of the most important points of Luther's theological breakthrough. So, as I said before, I want to look in more detail today at the problems that Luther saw in late medieval theology, which we covered last time, but today go into more detail about Luther's mature theology. Now, remember that from the very beginning, from the time that Augustine had wrote his anti-Pelagian writings, the question that had been vexing theologians was this. This is the whole issue from the time of Augustine until the time of Luther, and, well, now for that matter. The two main questions are these. What are the effects of the fall of man, that is, original sin, and in what manner must man be harnessed by grace to be set and kept on the way to salvation? These are the two central questions that people have had different answers to throughout the history of the church. And this was the central issue for Martin Luther. So how did he answer these two questions according to his mature theology? So we're just going to talk first about Luther's anthropology, and then I'm going to go into Luther's soteriology. Luther's anthropology, let's start with the doctrine of sin. Luther held to, as we've already hinted at in his breakthrough on the lectures on Romans, Luther held to a very strong doctrine of sin. Luther held that the fall of Adam into sin so damaged and destroyed the ability of man that afterwards he was no longer capable, without God's help, of doing anything that would be considered good by God. Now, you remember that Pelagius denied original sin. That was the whole occasion for Augustine's anti-Pelagian writings, or one of the major occasions for it. Pelagius said that the fall, the effects on sin, the effects on man of the fall weren't so bad, right? That maybe it was man's free will was weakened a little bit, or that he was tempted to imitate Adam in his sin. But in terms of his ability to do good, in terms of his ability to turn to God, well, that ability essentially remained intact. And this was the whole issue for Martin Luther on the eve of the Reformation. Now, nobody on the eve of the Reformation, none of the medieval theologians of the Via Moderna were actually full-fledged Pelagians, right? Even Pelagius himself wasn't really a full-fledged Pelagian in the sense that he didn't even want to talk about grace. But Luther, nevertheless, came to see that these medieval theologians of the Via Moderna, in particular the person who taught him, Gabriel Biel, had fallen off on the side toward Pelagianism. They were aware of the existence of Pelagianism. They tried to protect themselves from it by their system of doctrine. But according to Luther, these were just word games. These ideas of congruent merit and semi-merits and all of these things that they tried to use to get around Pelagianism, it was just words. So Luther returned in his mature theology and in his Reformation breakthrough to a strongly Augustinian, and for that matter Pauline, view of original sin. Here's what he said in the Bondage of the Will. Seeing that through the one transgression of the one man Adam, we are all under sin and damnation, how can we attempt anything that is not sinful and damnable? For when he says all, he's referring to Romans 5, all are under sin, he makes no exception either of the power of free choice or of any worker, but every man, whether he works or not, endeavors or not, is necessarily included among the all. Not that we should sin or be damned through that one transgression of Adam if it were not our own transgression, for who could be damned for another transgression, especially before God? It does not, however, become ours by any imitative doing of it ourselves, Pelagius, for then it would not be the one transgression of Adam, since it would be we and not Adam who committed it. But it becomes ours the moment we're born, a subject we must deal with some other time. Original sin itself, therefore, leaves the free choice with no capacity to do anything but sin and be damned. So this is a very strong view of the effects of the fall on man. Because of Adam's fall, humanity is helpless and hopeless and cannot take a single step in the direction of God without God's help. He adds these from the Disputation Against Scholastic Theology. He says, on the part of man, however, nothing precedes grace except indisposition and even rebellion against grace. There's nothing you can do. There's no step you can take. There's no movement you can make toward God to prepare yourself for grace. Before the moment that God empowers you with grace, you are a rebel, and you are totally indisposed against God. You are His enemy. You are ungodly. And then he added helpfully, or this is actually earlier in the document, in Disputation Against Scholastic Theology, man is by nature unable to want God to be God. Indeed, he himself wants to be God and does not want God to be God. So the sin here is pictured as not just we do wrong things, but we're rebelling against our very Creator. We're trying to usurp Him. We're trying to throw Him off His throne and make ourselves God. So that's, in a nutshell, Luther's doctrine of sin. He returned to a very strong Augustinian doctrine of sin, which he thought the late medieval theologians did not hold to. Well, they didn't hold to it. So, because, and we've already hinted at this, because of Luther's strong view of the effects of the fall on man, therefore, this leads to his doctrine of the bondage of the will. In his famous book, and other places, The Bondage of the Will. Now, it should be noted, importantly, and we already talked about this, if you remember way back when we looked at Augustine, Luther is right here with Augustine on all of these issues, I think, in terms of the bondage of the will. First of all, Luther rejects what we call libertarian free will. Now remember, we said that libertarian free will is this idea that if we're thinking of humans making choices as somebody going into an ice cream shop and choosing between different flavors of ice cream, a libertarian view of free will would say that man has no preferences, that he's an independent moral agent, and that when he goes into the ice cream shop and has to choose between chocolate and strawberry and vanilla, he's basically, well, it doesn't really even make sense, I don't think, but he's basically choosing almost randomly. There's nothing determining his choice. There's nothing conditioning his choice. He's an independent moral actor. But Luther, of course, like Augustine before him, rejected out of hand this view of free will. He says this, "It is false to state that man's inclination is free to choose between either of two opposites. Indeed, the inclination is not free, but captive." So for Luther, libertarian free will, and he makes a big deal about this in his in The Bondage of the Will, libertarian free will for Luther belongs to one and only one person, and that's God. For Luther, absolute freedom of choice belongs to God and to God alone. And this was Erasmus's whole problem, Luther said. In his book, the way that he talked about free will, he defined it in such a way that it was libertarian free will. And so, this is what Erasmus says. Erasmus says, by free choice in this place, we mean a power of the human will by which a man can apply himself to the things which lead to eternal salvation or turn away from them. So Luther immediately catches on that the problem with this is where he goes astray, right from the very beginning. And the whole problem with Erasmus's argument is it's predicated on a false and a wrong view, a definition of free will or free choice. For Luther, after the fall, man's will is in bondage to sin and only capable of doing evil. Now, Luther's views on this matter are a little bit complex, and I don't have time to go into all of them and all of their nuances. He does distinguish between free will in relation to things beneath him and free will in relation to things above him, that is, things above man. So, if you're deciding between going to Denny's and going to the Waffle House, that classic choice that we all have to make, whether you go to Denny's or the Waffle House, you're essentially, for Luther, free to choose whatever sub-quality restaurant that you'd like to go to. But when it comes to spiritual matters, when it comes to things relating to salvation, that's when man's will is in bondage to sin and is only capable of doing evil. Here's what Luther said in his, this is Thesis 13 of his Heidelberg Disputation. And these are actually interesting because he doesn't just, after the thesis, he provides a little paragraph to explain what he means. He says, here's the thesis: free will after the fall exists in name only, as long as it does, and as long as it does what it is able to do, it commits a mortal sin. And here's his little comment on it. He says, the first part is clear, for the will is captive and subject to sin. Not that it is nothing, right? Luther's not denying any free choice or free agency on the part of man. Not that it is nothing, but that it is not free except to do evil. According to John 8:34, everyone who commits sin is a slave to sin, so if the Son makes you free, you will be free indeed. Hence, St. Augustine says in his book, The Spirit and the Letter, free will without grace has the power to do nothing but sin. And in the second book, Against Julian, also by Augustine, you call the will free, but in fact it is an enslaved will, and in many other places. So you can see here that Luther, now Alistair McGrath says that Luther actually goes beyond. Alistair McGrath is like the scholar that Alistair McGrath has been guiding me through Luther during this whole time. He says that Luther actually goes beyond Augustine on this issue, and that whereas Augustine talked about the liberum arbitrium captivatum and the liberum arbitrium liberatum, Luther talks about the servum arbitrium. So Augustine says free will free and free will slave, or free will captive. Luther says servum arbitrium, enslaved will or bonded will. But I think the way that I read Luther, it sounds to me like he's basically saying the same thing as Augustine. The will is free, we have free choice, we have free agency, we might say. We're not robots. The problem is our desires. Like with Augustine, for Luther, before grace, before God's grace, the only thing that we want to do is sin. And even those times when we seem to do good, because there are a lot of discussions about the virtuous pagan or the man who dies for his country. Even those people ultimately don't do their good deeds with the right motives. They don't die for the glory of God. They don't die with that motive. They die ultimately for selfish reasons, for their own glory. So that was Luther's view of the bondage of the will. A very, very strong view of man condemned to sin. Are there any questions so far? Because so far, this is pretty much, as I read it, just a straight up return to Augustine. Maybe some developments here and there. Yeah?
When you talk about free will,
yeah.
on this, how are we supposed to, or how do we look at Adam and what, I guess, his will or what motivated him? Because that was prior to sin, and so I totally get where sin comes into play and the free will discussion there. Where Adam, as we're told, he's made in the image of God, we're told then, but there's not sin at that point, and it may maybe more nuanced than what I'm thinking, but
Right.
and I'm thinking a lot in terms of when he decides to eat of the fruit. I'm having trouble rationalizing keeping in the image of God. That to me would indicate he should do everything God wants him to. Yet then if he eats of the fruit, that kind of indicates he's going against what God wants. So
Right.
Is there some explanation or some thought process on how we think about Adam?
Yeah. Well, the short answer is it's a mystery why Adam sinned. And that's what John Murray says in his little book, or his little pamphlet on sin. We say that Adam, in Reformed theology, we say that Adam was in a state of innocence. So he was created good, he was created upright, and yet he wasn't confirmed in his righteousness. So he didn't have that unchangeable, final, eschatological righteousness that he would have earned had he obeyed and not eaten of the fruit of the tree, the knowledge of good and evil. And so Adam was created good and upright and yet subject to change. The way that I understand it, basically, Adam had free will in the purest sense of the word. And why exactly he chose to sin, what drew him there, because we can't say that he was sinful before he sinned. I don't know.
It was the woman.
It was the woman. You couldn't have put it better. No. And, of course, then that only, even if the problem goes back further, right? Because before he ate of the fruit, he decided to eat of the fruit. And then before he decided to eat of the fruit, the serpent had rebelled against God. And why would God create somebody who would rebel against him? So I think that I'm content to say, at least maybe I'll have an insight someday, that for now, that it basically was a mystery. So, any other questions before we move on? The next point is really spicy. So, yeah.
God gave His angels in the beginning and us the free will to choose between accepting Him and not accepting Him.
Mm-hmm.
That is one thing He imparted, and that's one reason why probably Adam ate the apple, was because he went of his own free will to eat that apple. Just like the Satan went of his own free will to rebel against God, because he
Right.
wanted people who would decide for themselves to follow him.
Right. Yeah. And, of course, the serpent worked his cunning on Adam and Eve. But ultimately, the reason I think it's a mystery is because there was no inclination there. Because Adam wasn't sinful. He was created upright. He was created good, knowledge, righteousness, and holiness.
But he was given free will.
Yeah, he was given free will. But, yeah, I do think, yeah, sure. Go ahead, Carl.
Well, I mean, the problem, especially as it relates to what you're talking about, is the relationship to desire.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The point is desire. So the tricky question, perhaps an answerable question for us right now, with regard to Adam, is what's the origin of evil desire?
Right. Yeah.
And
How did it happen?
I would quickly tack on to that. That's Christianity's problem, not the Reformed faith's problem.
Right. Sure.
That's a mystery for all of us.
Right. Yeah, and something that theologians have been wrestling with from the beginning. Yeah.
This might sound simplistic, but I mean, God chooses to reveal to us in His Word, and He didn't reveal that.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean,
This is a hidden things issue. That's why I say it's a mystery. Maybe we'll find out someday. Maybe we'll never know. Maybe a theologian will come along and solve it, but I doubt it. But for now, that's why I said I'm basically content to say we don't know. But we trust God and we trust His Word, and we trust that,
it says condition, man. I mean, it doesn't
Yeah.
give us that.
Right. All right. Let's move on. So the third point about Luther's anthropology is this. And this is important. While Luther in many ways revived or returned to the strong doctrine of sin of Augustine, there were several important ways that Luther actually diverged from Augustine, and this is one of them. Luther actually diverged from Augustine on his view of human nature, and especially concerning a distinction that a lot of previous theologians had made going back to Augustine when Paul talks about the distinction or the antithesis between the flesh and the spirit, right? In Paul's epistles, he brings up these categories of the flesh and the spirit, and seems to be talking about man making some distinctions within the person of man. Well, for a long time, going back to Augustine, Augustine himself had held that this distinction pointed to two completely separate natures in man, one of which was the higher nature, and the other of which was the lower nature. Obviously, the spirit is the higher nature in man, and the flesh is the lower nature in man. And so Augustine held to this dualistic anthropology, and it was affected, I think, by his Platonism. And for Augustine, this higher nature, the spirit or soul, tends toward God, while the lower nature, the flesh, or often associated with the body, is weighed down by sin and the things of the world. So the soul is, or the spirit is like the good part of us, the part that tends toward God. And the body is the part that's weighing the soul down and preventing the soul from attaining to God. But Luther rejects this way of understanding this distinction. For Luther comes to interpret this flesh-spirit dichotomy theologically rather than anthropologically. So Augustine had it basically interpreted it anthropologically, referring to two different natures within man. Luther interpreted it theologically. For Luther, the flesh and the spirit don't refer to two separate competing natures in man, but each of those terms refers to different aspects of the whole man as he is viewed in relation to God. So in other words, man, body, soul, and spirit, is either characterized as flesh or characterized as spirit. It's not that there's one part of man that's seeking God and another part of man that's being pulled down by the things of the earth. It's that the entire man, considered as turned in upon himself, in its irrepressible egoism and its radical alienation from God, is either flesh or spirit. So, the flesh is the entire man considered as a sinner. And the spirit is the entire man considered as, understood as, in his openness to God and the divine promises. And this is referred to as Luther's totus homo anthropology. Simply means whole man. Luther's whole man anthropology. Now this is important. This is really important because it led to his development of the doctrine of justification, of his doctrine of justification. Now I'm going to come back to that later. I want to talk about a couple other things first. But are there any questions about that in particular? Yeah.
So in Augustine, were the flesh and spirit, were they at equal forces, or was it because of Augustine's view of sin, it was the flesh that had priority over the spirit before conversion?
Yeah. I don't think I could say off the top of my head precisely how he would have weighted those two parts of man's nature. But the bigger point is just that they were competing aspects of man's nature that seem to respond to different things. The soul tended toward God, and the flesh was weighed down by the things of the earth, especially afflicted by concupiscence. Yeah.
So did Luther conceive of this as a whole anthropology, or just as a regenerative anthropology?
What do you mean?
Well, in other words, the idea of these competing, I'm wondering in particular how this squares with what you would say about sin as rebellion.
Okay.
In other words, he's removed himself from this sort of dualism, body,
Right.
spirit, and I think rightfully captured the essence of sin, which is pride and self-exaltation against God. So how does that fit into what you're talking about now in terms of these competing, or I can't remember exactly how you put it, but
Yeah.
competing elements within human nature?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea is just that man, in his rebellion against God, is in rebellion against God with his whole man, his whole nature, his whole being. And that there isn't one specific part of him that's rebelling against God and the other part which tends toward God. So, this is the Platonic idea that the body is the prison house for the spirit. That the spirit tends toward the eternal, the world of the forms, and it's trying to return there, and the body is being weighed down by the imperfect things of this world, the becoming.
Okay, but the thing I'm still puzzled about is that by taking spirit and flesh, he's opposing, or maybe I'm misunderstanding this, but for example, spirit, flesh, a la Galatians chapter 5, is essentially the Holy Spirit lusting against the flesh spirit. It's not an internal anthropological idea. So in Luther's view, if the spirit and flesh are both internal human dynamics taking place, but there's conflict, but both of them are tending toward evil. What's the conflict? That's not me. Make sense?
No, there's no conflict.
Oh, okay, that's what it is.
Yeah.
He's just saying they're both subsumed under evil nature.
Yeah.
And they're both captive to sin. That's
Whatever the precise relationship between the soul and the spirit, or the soul and the body, they're both affected, they're both in rebellion against God.
okay.
However they're interacting.
That's what I missed.
Okay,
Quick question.
sure.
Does the totus homo open the door to his insight of simultaneous?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you, Sergio.
That.
Yep. Okay, so prevenient grace. His soteriology. Let's move on to his soteriology. Prevenient grace. The idea that we've been dealing with, put forward by Augustine from the very beginning. Luther returns to this idea of prevenient grace. Remember, against the theology of the Via Moderna. The theology of the Via Moderna, the modern way, the late medieval theologians, taught that man could, before he received God's grace, make a movement toward God. He could do quod in se est. He could do what lies within him. And this, as the saying went, God will not deny His grace to the man who does his best. So for the theologians of the Via Moderna, man is capable of making the first move toward God. Man is the one who initiates the process of salvation. This is what Luther saw as unacceptable and Pelagian. Here's what Alistair McGrath says. The cornerstone of both Luther's theological breakthrough and his subsequent controversy with the church of his day appears to have been his insight that humans cannot initiate the process of justification, and his conviction that the church of his day had, by affirming the direct opposite, fallen into the Pelagian error. So Luther, in reaction against these late medieval theologians, whom he perceived as Pelagian, developed a very strong doctrine of prevenient grace. And of course, this flows from Luther's doctrine of sin and his doctrine of man. One of the things I said when we were talking about Augustine is that the universal law among theologians and soteriology is that the stronger your doctrine of sin is, the stronger your doctrine of grace has to be. If you have a weak doctrine of sin, if you kind of say, oh, Adam kind of messed up, but, we're all not perfect, then your doctrine of grace is going to be weak. And what happens when your doctrine of grace is weak? God gets less glory. Because that's the whole point of salvation history, is that God gets the glory because He does the work. Because we can't do it, because we're sinners. Because without God's grace, man's will is in bondage to sin, and he can only will evil and rebel against God, then man, for Luther, is unable to initiate his own salvation, and God's grace is therefore necessary in order for man to come to God. And there are 100 million quotes that I could have had here, but I don't have any quotes. So you can read Bondage of the Will if you want a whole book that's a quote for this one. Yeah.
Isn't this also an altered type of perspective to predestination and the all-knowingness of God, of us being Christians at the very beginning of time, the Alpha and the Omega?
Yes, and that's my very next point. I'm glad you brought that up. What's the ultimate form of prevenient grace? The ultimate form of prevenient grace is before you were born, not only that, before I created the world, before that, before I created space and time, from all eternity past, I chose you. And that's why Luther took a very strong view of predestination. Here's what he said in The Bondage of the Will. And by the way, if you say, I want to read one thing by Luther, read Bondage of the Will. Luther himself considered it one of his better works, and one he doesn't always write things with very careful planning and with very careful nuance. But Bondage of the Will is one of them, and he knew that. He says this, "For if we believe it to be true that God foreknows and predestines all things, that He can neither be mistaken in His foreknowledge nor hindered in His predestination, and that nothing takes place but as He wills it, as reason itself is forced to admit, then on the testimony of reason itself, there cannot be any free choice in man or angel or any creature." And that's it. Predestination for Luther is the ultimate expression of what it means for God to be God. If you think that if you believe that God is a omnipotent, omnipresent, sovereign being, then logically speaking, A, He's the only one who could really have libertarian free will, and B, He had to create the whole universe, and so everything that happens must have been ordained, planned by Him, predestined. And so for Luther, that's a necessity. That's what it means to believe in God. We believe that He's the predestining God. He's the sovereign God. And anything short of that, which allows man's free will to shine forth, doesn't allow God to be God. And that's where Erasmus has gone wrong, ultimately. Okay, so prevenient grace, predestination. Like I said, there's so much more I could have included here. I could have talked about faith. I could have talked about other aspects of his doctrine of grace. But I think I only have time to talk about this, but it's an important one. We need to talk about Luther's view of justification. Now, here's where Luther is brilliant. Remember, back when we talked about Augustine, that I dropped this little piece of information. Augustine did not distinguish between justification and sanctification. Justification for Augustine was a lifelong process of renovation, and it included what we would now call regeneration and sanctification. But for Augustine, and for every medieval theologian that came after him, there was no distinction between the renovative and the declarative. There's no distinction between justification and sanctification. And so Luther's insight into the nature of justification was radically new and different. On the basis of the totus homo anthropology, the anthropology that saw flesh and spirit as being different aspects of the same man, or different ways to consider the whole man rather than different competing natures within man, Luther says that man is simul justus et peccator, simultaneously just and sinful, simultaneously righteous and a sinner. Here's what he says. This is in his lectures on Romans. For inasmuch as the saints are always aware of their sin and seek righteousness from God in accord with His mercy, for this very reason they are always also regarded as righteous by God. Thus in their own sight and in truth they are unrighteous. But before God they are righteous because He reckons them so because of their confession of sin. They are actually sinners, but they are righteous by the imputation of a merciful God. They are unknowingly righteous and knowingly unrighteous. They are sinners in fact, but righteous in hope. So the key for Luther was this. Justifying righteousness in this conception was recognizable as such before God, or coram Deo, but not before man. And in fact, the way that Luther talks about this justifying righteousness is that when you get this justifying righteousness, you don't come to see yourself as righteous. And humanly speaking, this is not a righteousness that you can see or recognize. But before God, it is a righteousness that is valid. So as a Christian, when you receive this righteousness, you actually become more and more aware of your sinfulness, paradoxically. Now, what this meant was this. If Luther says that we're simultaneously just and sinful, we're simultaneously righteous and a sinner, that meant he needed to develop a new concept of the nature of justifying righteousness. And this is Luther's most radical and innovative idea in all of his thought. The righteousness that we receive is not a righteousness that is intrinsic to us. It is the Justitia Christi Aliena. That is, it is the alien righteousness of Christ. For Luther, the righteousness by which a believer is justified is not his own righteousness that comes from within him, but the alien righteousness of Christ, which is external to him. It's outside of him, and it's appropriated by him by faith alone. This is what Luther calls the great exchange. Christ's righteousness is appropriated by the believer when we reach out by faith and grab on to Jesus, and the believer and our sin is given over to Christ. Now, this is where Luther diverges from Augustine. This is Luther's most remarkable insight, and I think this is worth reflecting on. This insight that Luther had, that we are justified by a righteousness that is outside of us, that is external to us, and that is not our own righteousness, but Christ's righteousness, had never been thought of in the whole history of the church. All of the greatest thinkers in the history of Christianity did not think of this idea. Augustine, Aquinas, Anselm, nobody ever thought of this idea. It's so remarkable, and it's Luther's more than anything else, because a lot of other things that Luther believed you could find in various medieval theologians. There was a movement in the Middle Ages to return to the theology of Augustine. There was a movement to say that we're saved by grace alone. But this idea of the alien righteousness of Christ, and that the sinner, the Christian, is simultaneously just and sinful, that's brand new. Luther, nobody had ever thought of that before Luther thought of it. 1,500 years! I think it's really cool. Now, are there any questions about that? Yeah.
Okay, going back to the totus, this goes back to my previous question.
Okay.
So how does the totus homo open the door to the simul? Because I think those two ideas are related, but how do those two ideas...
Yeah, previously sin was seen as belonging exclusively to one part of man's nature. So the sin was located in the flesh, the fleshly part of man.
Skin, right?
No, the lower nature of man. The nature that drags him down, that's affected by concupiscence, that makes him inclined to sin. That's where sinfulness was located before, whereas the higher nature was seen as tending toward God. But Luther sees that the one man is either in rebellion against God or he's for God. He's seeking God. And he can't be split. There's a war going on within him, but the actual orientation of man can only be seen in relation in either one of two ways. So the fact that man can be righteous before God in one sense, And yet a sinner, in another sense, could not have happened without the totus homo anthropology. Does that make sense?
So, if man is that sinful, he cannot in of himself achieve that righteousness. And so the simul, in one way you could phrase it, was worked out as a solution to that conundrum. Does that make sense?
I don't think it was, I think it was the other way around.
Okay.
I think Luther came to see that man, he came to his insight about the totus homo anthropology, and then from that, I think, flowed the idea that man is at the same time just and a sinner.
So would he say that if you're a Christian, you're in the spirit, or?
Okay, let's talk after the service, because I don't have much time. There are some other things I have to get through. Okay, so now one thing I will note here, and we're almost done, is that Luther does not actually make the distinction between justification and sanctification, at least to the extent that the later reformers such as Melanchthon and Calvin would. But clearly, this is the groundwork for everything we believe in today. This is the groundwork for the Westminster Confession of Sin. The Westminster. Oh man. Yeah. The Westminster Confession of Faith statement that justification is a declarative act, is an act of God, whereas sanctification is a work of God. That justification is something that's imputed, whereas sanctification is something that is on the basis of that imparted. So, I don't have time to read that. Let me just finish with this, and then I'll read a poem. For Luther, and we talked last week about the crisis of assurance in late medieval theology. For Luther, the most powerful solution to the lack of assurance that he saw in the late medieval theology was this what I call a monergistic conception of salvation. I'm going to read, here's what he said in The Bondage of the Will. He says this: "For my own part, I frankly confess that even if it were possible, I should not wish to have free choice given to me, or to have anything left in my own hands by which I might strive toward salvation. For on the one hand, I should be unable to stand firm and keep hold of it amid so many adversities and perils and so many assaults of demons, seeing that even one demon is mightier than all men, and no man at all could be saved. And on the other hand, even if there were no perils or adversities or demons, I should nevertheless have to labor under perpetual uncertainty and to fight as one beating the air, since even if I lived and worked to eternity, my conscience would never be assured and certain how much it ought to do to satisfy God. For whatever work might be accomplished, there would always remain an anxious doubt whether it pleased God or whether He required something more, as the experience of all self-justifiers proves, and as I myself learned to my bitter cost through so many years. But now, since God has taken my salvation out of my hands into His, making it depend on His choice and not on mine, and has promised to save me, not by my own work or exertion, but by His grace and mercy, I am assured and certain both that He is faithful and will not lie to me, and also that He is too great and powerful for any demons or any adversities to be able to break Him or snatch me from Him. No one, he says, shall snatch them out of my hand, because my Father who has given them to me is greater than all. So it comes about that, if not all, some, and indeed many, are saved, whereas by the power of free choice none at all would be saved, but all would perish together. Moreover, we are also certain and sure that we please God not by the merit of our own working, but by the favor of His mercy promised to us, and that if we do less than we should do it, or or do it badly, He does not hold this against us, but in a fatherly way pardons and corrects us. Hence the glorifying of all the saints in their God. So that's all I have to say about Luther, and we are out of time. I won't read the poem.
Next week.
There won't be a next week.
Read it.